Achtung, Achtung. Welcome to We Have Ways of Making You Talk with me, Al Murray, and James Holland. It's a Thursday edition. Where to start? Well, at the weekend, we did our special edition to do with Remembrance Sunday, to mark Remembrance Sunday. And we've had an extraordinary outpouring of, a response from lots of you listeners, from regular listeners, and from people all over the world.
It's been lovely, hasn't it? Been really nice.
It has been really touching, and my mum got in touch to say thank you for what you said about Granny and all that sort of thing, you know.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's been a lovely response, and I think what was really good about Sunday, and what's been good about the response to this is, you know, we do get caught up in some of the adventure and the thrill of the gigantic historical spectacle of the Second World War, but to actually give it some thought, give some thought towards remembrance, I think is really important. And also that we've heroically steered clear of the so-called poppy debate, I think is to our credit, James. But anyway, we have an email. We received an email that really that's quite extraordinary. So I'd like to start with that. It's from John Witter. Now, John says, "Hi there. I'm emailing you partly because I'm technologically old-fashioned, and also I want to hear Al have yet another go at an email user. I am a relatively recent but very keen listener to your podcast and have been enjoying it immensely." Well, thank you. "I live on an island in the middle of the South Pacific called Rarotonga in the Cook Islands. We are between American Samoa and Tahiti." Right.
How about that? I mean, this podcast getting all the way around the world like that. Yesterday, I listened to your chat with Glyn Prusser, formerly of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. Our family owes much to the CWGC. At the outbreak of World War I, the Cook Islands, only recently annexed by New Zealand, saw 500 men enlist to go to war. This was from a very small population, and as a percentage of that population, this enlistment was apparently amongst one of the highest in the world. To give you some perspective, our population is now only about 14,000. Amongst those men was my grandfather and one of his younger brothers, who, we believe, like many, lied about his age. They went to basic training in New Zealand, then embarked on a journey that took them to Palestine, Egypt and France. Because Cook Islanders had only been in contact with outsiders for a bit over a century, our immunity to common illnesses was still weak, and many soldiers did not even survive basic training and the trip to war. That's extraordinary, isn't it?
Yeah, it is quite extraordinary. And a thing you just don't think of. No. Several are buried in Auckland, having succumbed to common illnesses. So, why do we owe so much to the CWGC? My grandfather's brother never came home, being killed in the Somme in 1916. In the same barrage that killed him, my grandfather was seriously wounded. He was fortunate to survive his injuries. My grandfather returned and carried the literal and emotional scars of war and losing his brother until he died in his late 90s. Like the Maori in New Zealand, having a body to fare well is very important to us. My great-grandparents never got that, and as a father myself, I cannot even begin to imagine how that must have hurt. Fast forward to the 1990s when my brother moved to the UK to complete his medical training. Through the CWGC and the incredible job they do, he found our great-uncle's grave. As a result, some of us have been able to visit and pay our respects to him and those who lie with him. When we visited him for the first time in 1991, we left a bronze plaque in front of his headstone. This plaque was one that was sent to families who had lost loved ones. When my brother took our mother a few years later, the plaque, sadly, had disappeared. Hoping for the best, my brother contacted the CWGC and asked if they knew anything about it. Their amazing reply came back to say that yes, indeed, they knew about the plaque. Because of where we had placed it, they were concerned that regular garden maintenance might damage it, so they had carefully buried it at the foot of the headstone. Someone had checked to see if it was still there, and it was. Given the circumstances, would we like it returned? Yes, please, was our reply. The plaque was promptly sent back to us. It was winter when we visited my great-uncle's grave, and it was difficult to see his grave in such a cold place compared to our tropical home. However, the care with which the cemetery is attended is beyond words, and we take great comfort from knowing his final resting place is so painstakingly maintained and respected. If possible, please convey our thanks to Glyn and those at the CWGC. Lest we forget, Private Apu Teperetu, service number 16/1222, died the 30th of September 1916, buried at Quarry Cemetery, Montauban, plot number 2H3. Thanks again, and looking forward to more great podcasts. Regards, John Witter.
Wow.
I mean, what, hairs are up on the back of my neck. I don't know about you, James.
Absolutely, and it's yet again, it's that, millions of statistic, but an individual is an individual, isn't it? It's bringing it back down. It's the tiny piece of the mosaic, isn't it? It's funny, isn't it? Because this whole podcast, ever since we started it, it's just got me thinking in different ways. I know we're the ones who are supposed to know what we're talking about, but it's lovely to have this input and have one's eyes opened to stories, different experiences, different points of view, different perspectives, a whole host of stuff. I've learned so much myself from chatting to everyone and reading the mail that comes in. So my I suppose my response to that is, please keep it coming, everyone who feels inclined to do so. And all the emails that do get sent in, they do all get read. And they get read by all of us, and they get collected, and we go through them all, and they are hugely appreciated. Unfortunately, because you and I whittle on so much and kind of go down lots of cul-de-sacs and all the rest of it.
We don't cover it all the time.
We don't cover it all, but it's lovely having it. It really is. I mean, it's lovely having photographs and all sorts of other stuff that comes in, and tiny plastic models.
I mean, what strikes me about that though, that in particular is, and it's a thing we do talk about, but I don't know that sometimes is appreciated enough, and sometimes this gets brought up in a kind of in our current climate of and I'm loath to use the word political correctness, but in the way people are choosing to look at stuff, right? And we have to remember to frame the First World War and the Second World War as imperial conflicts. We really, really do. And imperial is a dirty word and all that sort of thing. But what I'm really struck by there is I didn't, that the Cook Islands were annexed by New Zealand, so they're a colony of a colony. So what we're really looking at here is absolute far arm's length from Britain, and here they are fighting for that. Here they are in France fighting for that cause, which is after all a European security squabble war anyway. At that point, well, that's the initial casus belli. And to think that someone from the Cook Islands and who were so late introduced into European history, they're not part of the European story, and yet they are. And yet these guys come, they volunteer, they lie about their age to come and fight in France. It's the most extraordinary thing, and I think, not in a we mustn't forget that the people from all over the world fought for us way, but jeepers, people from all over the world fought for the British Empire willingly.
Yes.
Maybe he lied about his age because he fancied the pay as much as anything else, but for an adventure and all that sort of thing. And you just have to remember that, and we talked about it with Glyn that in these graveyards you have the picture of the British Empire, which again means you have to reframe this. We did this on our own thing. You have to.
Yeah, you absolutely do.
In fact, we can't reframe it. Even you have to ditch it. You have to completely ditch it, because that's certainly not how people at the time viewed it. They viewed both wars at the time as an imperial effort. It's only the end of the Second World War where it collapses back into a national effort, and after all for political reasons, because you've got an election, you've got parties trying to find their way through it, and you've also got how you present it to the Americans, because there's crushing debt coming at the end of the Second World War. But you know what I mean?
Absolutely. But that is. But that is why the narrative, this negative narrative, has sprung up in the last, 40 years, since the 60s, really, particularly about sort of Britain's effort in the Second World War, because those who are writing it from the perspective of Britain then, decline as a great power, the collapse of the empire, post-empire guilt, 3-day weeks of the 1970s, all those sort of things are coming to play in that narrative, and that's why you get this kind of negative thing, and also from Americans, because Americans are looking at tiny little Britain, they're thinking, really, this was A, this is the old enemy in Bunker Hill and Lexington, but B, this kind of sort of broken down old country, that shed its imperial skin, the idea that this was once a great kind of, preeminent nation of the planet, it just seems ridiculous.
Yeah.
So that is affecting it. And it's almost like we've sort of, we've gone past that now. So we can now, we've sort of got over that. And now we can look back a bit more kind of.
Well, that's exactly,
objectively.
that's exactly what I was going to say, is that perhaps we're in a position where we've gone through those things enough to the point where actually we can go, well, hang on a minute, let's look at this. Let's look at this without those sets of baggage. And obviously there's current baggage, which is people, I mean, in a way, reassessing empire as much as anything else, rather than simply forgetting about it, which was the, very much the political tack, because you were focusing on nation politically for the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. That you were trying to move empire out of the picture. That we have to admit, big part of all this reassessment of our relationship with slavery. I think it's all part of this reassessment as well. But I'm just so struck by that. I mean, struck by the fact that someone in the Cook Islands is listening to us for a start. Trace element of empire there, but also that the Cook Islands, of course they were annexed by New Zealand, which was annexed by Great Britain. Yeah, exactly. It's just this sort of this extended family, for want of probably for want of a better word, because after all, some of the family were press ganged into being relations. But I just think it's so interesting, and that remembrance and that aspect of remembrance. Of course, that as Glyn was telling us, people were keen that no one was repatriated, so everyone was even before the empire. And now that if your culture doesn't believe in that and needs the body, what are you going to do?
Well, yes, but I mean, Glyn was touching that on Sunday, wasn't it? It was interesting also today because we're recording this on the 11th of the 11th, and I happened to be in London this morning. And at 11 o'clock, I was twiddling my thumbs, waiting for Rachel to finish her appointment. And so I thought, okay, well, I wandered down to Green Park and go to the Bomber Command Memorial. It's as good a place to be as any, since, I'm around at 11 o'clock and I can sort of pause and contemplate life for 2 minutes at 11 o'clock. And it's interesting when you look at, it's got that amazing statue of the bomber crew, but on the inside of the kind of the sort of the structure around it, it says, to commemorate the men of all nations. So again, and this was only, when was that? 2012, I think that was.
It's 2012.
That was inaugurated. And it was rather lovely to be there, actually, to gaze up at those wonderful statues and those young men sort of staring up at the sky and sort of clutching their helmets by their sides and, with their Mae Wests on and all the rest of it. And actually, I wondered whether anyone would be there, whether it would just be me. But there must have been kind of 25, 30 people, I guess. There were a few servicemen. There were a couple of policemen. There was some girls there. There were various people and a sombre little bunch we made. Standing there trying to sort of contemplate, or at least I was trying to contemplate what those guys had gone through, and just realised how inadequate my mind was for dealing with that. And how, and I've spoken obviously to lots of Bomber Command veterans and lots of 8th Air Force veterans and bomber crews and all the rest of it, and German bomber crews for that matter as well. And you can only sort of scratch the surface, I think, of what that was all about. But always good to sit and just ponder about these things in silence.
Yeah, I watched the Unknown Warrior service at Westminster Abbey. The Beeb ran the coverage on, and although it's more geared to the First World War, and I think it's quite interesting that the First World War has become so sort of emblematic in remembrance rather than the Second World War, because after all, the sort of traditional certainly the thing I grew up with is that the Second World War is the just war against bad guys. The First World War is entirely pointless, and yet the First World War has become the thing on which. All the iconography is Flanders iconography, and I know the poppies from Flanders Field, but you know what I mean. It's like it's the tilt, the Tommy, with his head at rest over his rifle. That's a First World War image, and it's interesting that in a way has become the sort of iconography of remembrance. When I always thought that we thought the First World War was terrible and pointless. The Second World War was the one that was where we did the right thing.
Yeah, it is.
So maybe remembrance is about the people who died for something, died over something pointless. And then it gets more, all these things they're far more complicated than simply, why aren't you wearing a puppy? They're just so much more complicated than that. And they're inevitably political. And they're, after all, and the thing, again, I was thinking more about what we talked with Glyn about remembrance as a form of protest. And I think that, I think that's entirely true. And when people talk about the red poppy glorifying war, I simply don't know what they're saying. They're saying, don't do this again. People wearing red poppies are saying, hey, politicians, watch your step. You can't get away with this, I think. And it that these things.
Well, it goes back to that conversation with Eisenhower and Walter Cronkite in 1964, where he's saying, what I really think when I look at this is to make sure that we never allow this to happen again. But I also think it's all these sort of conflicting emotions. I think that's absolutely fine. I think the past is complicated, and our present day relationship with the past is complicated, and there's nothing wrong with that. I remember talking to Justin Macheski, who's the director of the National Army Museum. And he said it's perfectly okay for us to be proud of our heritage, but also appalled by our heritage. Yeah. You're allowed to have contradictory emotions about this stuff. Yeah. You can feel completely conflicted about Bomber Command. You can be completely in awe of the bombing crew, but still be repulsed by what happened at Pforzheim. There's nothing wrong with that at all. No. And it's this kind of constant wish to kind of make everything binary and make it black or white, and it isn't. Life isn't. It's shades of all sorts of different colours, and actually one's understanding of the past and study of the past is infinitely more interesting when it's more complex. When it is a kind of sort of cut and dry, what's to debate? And one of the interesting things about our analysis of the past is discussing it and debating it, and you going, no, Monty was a tactical genius at Alamein, and me going, come on, mate, what about his fire plan? I mean, that's what makes it fun. That's what's interesting, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And I don't think people should be ashamed of it either.
But that's what's illuminating about it as well, is that because after all, if what you're going to the past for is parallels and things to learn from and lessons of history, with a capital L and a capital H, if that's what you're looking history for, I mean, if you're comparing, and people do it an awful lot at the moment, they compare Trump to the 1930s, they compare what's happening all over. Yes. The 1930s is a sort of default stop for people to compare events to. And I actually think if you're comparing things to the 1930s, the place you should start is how they're different. The place you should start is the differences, not the similarities. Yes. Because after all, this is a different era. And one of the seductions of, and I think it's an interesting thing about the 20th century is because so much of it is on film, one of the seductions of the 20th century is you can watch it and you can look at it, and because it's in your eyes, it's so much more relatable than paintings of Romans at baths or whatever, which is all you've got of Rome, really. I mean, God knows how your brother or Gladiator, exactly. Well, exactly. But there's footage of the last century allows people to look at. If you see tanks rolling now, you go, oh, it's like the tanks in the 30s. Was in fact. No, it's not. It's different. The similarities of the different differences are the things that are important. And after all, the fact that hopefully we've learned from those events some things, and there's some, obviously there's some warnings and all that sort of thing. And I just sort of, if you try and boil it, like you say, if you try and reduce it to a binary, you won't learn a thing from it.
No, you won't. You absolutely won't. And I think the thing is that everyone sort of goes, history repeating itself and all this kind of stuff. History doesn't repeat itself. Patterns of human behaviour do, because fundamentally, I know the past is a foreign country and all the rest of it, as L.P. Hartley said, but even the Romans felt emotions of fear, jealousy, love, hate, all those kind of things, and those things haven't gone away. and so patterns of human behaviour do kind of follow, and you can see, you know, when there's economic crisis, as you know, political disruption follows, you know, and there are those lessons to be learned, and you know, that's one of the reasons, of course, for studying the past, but it's also to understand why we are the nation we are today. You know, everything that's happened before obviously is part of that great big mixture, that great big mosaic, since we're on the mosaic kind of analogy, and that's what helps us where we get to today. You know, I mean, it's very interesting getting these kind of different perspectives. I mean, you know, obviously I'm doing all this stuff on the Sherwood Rangers at the moment, and I was going through an interview that I did with John Semken, who was A Squadron commander for much of Normandy and through to November 1944. And he was going, you know, we realised that, you know, these infantry guys were coming in and their training was just awful. You know, it was just absolutely rubbish. You know, you had these 18, 19-year-olds coming in and they just hadn't got a clue what they were doing. You know, and that's just not true. I mean, you know, they were quite well trained. It's just, how can you train to come up against kind of, you know, the 2nd SS Panzer Division?
Well, or against anyone shooting a rifle. Because after all, one of the things we've talked about very, very recently is how many people are actually trained to this mythical Panzer SS standard anyway on the other side of the hill. You know, how many of these crack Germans are even out there? But someone firing at you with a machine gun, and it doesn't have to be an MG42, it could be absolutely anything, is enough to put the collies in the most well-trained people imaginable.
But the reason why John was saying that was because of his utter horror at the slaughter of these young men who were being, you know, for him, that was lions being led by donkeys. You know, that was, you know, that was just the sort of, you know, the meat mincer, and he never got over it. You know, it was absolutely clear talking to him that he was psychologically scarred in a profound and deep and terrible way ever since 1944, and who can blame him? But it didn't mean that. I mean, that was his opinion, and this is my point. You know, it's fine to have different views on this stuff, and he was there, God damn it. But you and I know that actually there was well trained as a conscript could possibly be, really, in the big scheme of things. I mean, you know, obviously, well, smaller things you could do better, but.
And his experience, of course, would be worth far more than all the training they'd ever had, too.
Of course, and you know, and you know, that is why the Italians at the end of the Tunisia campaign, for example, are not at all bad. It's because there's a cadre of them that have been there since 1940 and they've learned the hard way.
They've figured it out,
They figured it out, you know, themselves through experience. But if you're coming to joining the Italian army in 1943 from Italy, you're going to be shit because the training would have been awful. Anyway, what I must just say today is that it is actually publication day of An Englishman at War, the paperback version.
All right, James, we've got to take a short break. Tell me all about it in a minute. I can't believe he's got another book out. Welcome back to We Have Ways of Making You Talk. So tell me all about An Englishman at War, James.
Yeah, okay, so it's a bit of a cheat, Al, to be honest, because this is a book that came out, I think, probably, you know, 6 to 8 years ago in hardback, and for all sorts of very good reasons, it just hasn't come out in paperback, but now it has. And this is the wartime diaries of Stanley Christopherson, and I know I do. You know, a bit like, you know, I do bang on about the Sherwood Rangers a little bit, and you know,
well, me and the airborne at Arnhem. I mean, you know.
a bit, yeah, probably a bit worse than that, to be honest, for me. But and I apologise, everyone, bear with me. But this came about because way back in 2004, I went to Normandy for the first time, and a mate of mine who lives up in Yorkshire gathered together a group of people, and they're all really into the historic vehicles and stuff and classic cars and things, and we all went over, and I went over in my Citroen, they all went over in kind of command cars and jeeps and what have you. Anyway, one of the party that was there was a chap called David Christopherson, and we were standing on Gold Beach and we were looking at this bunker that had a great big sort of chunk out of it near the Embouchure. And David was going, well, the interesting thing is, you know, my dad came ashore here with A Squadron of the Sherwood Rangers. And, you know, and I was sort of going, you know, shut the front door. And he said, yeah, and he said, amazing thing about this bunker is that he said it was the Essex Yeomanry who were the artillery support for the Sherwood Rangers. He said they were having a terrible time on the beach, and then this guy from the Essex Yeomanry knocked out this bunker. And that's what enabled them to get off the beach and get inland. And, you know, they were at the edge of Bayeux by the end of day one on D-Day. And this little voice went, that was me. And it was this.
Really?
It was the guy from the Essex Yeomanry who'd fired the killer blow.
Unbelievable.
Yeah. Anyway, so we had this amazing time, and we were and I got to know David Christopherson really, really well. We really got on incredibly well, became firm friends. Anyway, during that trip, he kind of said, my dad was here, and he ended up commanding the squadron basically through to the end of the war. And I was, as you can imagine, was all agog at this. He said, and he kept all these diaries, and he said, I brought some of them with me. And we were staying at a place called Audreux, which is just kind of a bit to the north of Tilly-sur-Seulles, between Tilly-sur-Seulles and Bayeux. And we're staying there, and he goes, I think my dad was pretty close to here, around kind of, 7th, 8th of June. A place called Point 103. So anyway, we kind of looked on the map and stuff, and realised that it was literally a mile away from where we were staying, just by complete chance. So David and I cut away from the rest of the group and went up there, and we found this tree-lined track, and it was absolutely one and the same that was being described in the diary. And it was an amazing thing. And then we went down into Saint-Pierre, which is a little hamlet on the edge of Tilly, down the sort of the hill below. And that was where on the 11th, Sunday, the 11th of June, the regimental headquarters of the Sherwood Rangers got a direct hit from a shot from the Panzer-Lehr, and the CO and the intelligence officer and the adjutant were all killed. And at that point, Stanley then became acting CO, and on the 15th of June became confirmed commanding officer of the Sherwood Rangers Yeomanry, a position he kept up until the end of the war. Anyway, this so began my kind of interest in the Sherwood Rangers, and particularly in Stanley. And I was doing a book on the war in North Africa at the time, so I got the diaries and I included Stanley and the Sherwood Rangers, and then found there was this link with Keith Douglas and all the rest of it. So I started writing about them quite a lot. And suddenly the opportunity came to kind of edit all these diaries down. They're really, really good. There's some sort of 300,000 words of them. And what's really interesting about the Sherwood Rangers is, like those sort of classic interwar yeomanry regiments, they're still on horseback. They're still their main job is to protect the homeland and do sort of shire, county militia stuff. And there's a picture of them at summer camp in August 1939 on the estate of the Earl of Yarborough. And there they all are on their horses with their Sam Browns and their riding boots, and they look like they've just sort of stepped out of Omdurman. I mean, they just don't look ready for the Second World War at all. And frankly, nor were they. And they were all packed off to Palestine, where they did one of the kind of last sabres raised charges against Arab insurrectionists. Then there was a horse stampede, which was a great humiliation to them. So they had their horses, had their horses taken away from them. And then massively infradig, they were converted into artillery, because of course there weren't any tanks. They hadn't got enough tanks. And so part of them were on the siege, were in Crete. A couple of the squadrons, or then became batteries, were sent to the siege of Tobruk, including Stanley. And only in I think end of 1941, early 1942 were they mechanised. And their first action was the Battle of Alam Halfa, and then Alamein, and then all the way through North Africa into Tunisia, D-Day, and all the way through to the end of the war. But what is really interesting about that regiment is, in a way, they can be seen as a sort of leitmotif for the British Army in the Second World War.
Yeah.
Sort of starting off a little bit behind the bar, behind the 9-ball, but actually by the end of it, not at all bad.
And showing that was. I mean, that's what's sort of also that's emblematic of the Second World War itself, is that you enter it at the end of the you could argue you enter the Second World War kind of in the hangover of the Edwardian settlement or George V settlement. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And then you're in the modern world in 1945. Your jet planes and penicillin in 1945. It's a 6-year catalytic moment that changes everything, and changes politics forever, changes technology forever, and you've got the hangovers of the Victorian world in 1939, which is guys in cavalry doing sabre charges, and by 1945 you've jet interceptors, ballistic missiles,
yes,
and a society that reflects those changes too. I mean.
It's fascinating. And the other thing is, they're all sort of squires and county types, and the ace. the kind of the tank ace is Sergeant Dring, who's a jockey and a master huntsman before the war, but is, you know, very much kind of sort of, you know, he's working class, he's small, he can read the land just like any, you know, better than anyone, you know, and you've got all these sort of eccentrics and characters and stuff. You've got Donny Player, who's a kind of sort of team hero, who's from Players Cigarettes, you know, so he's absolutely minted. He gets killed in Tunisia, but you know, when they go over to Palestine, you know, they're on the boat train, you know, to Marseille, and sort of drinking champagne all the way and all that kind of stuff. And when they get to Palestine, there's lots of cricket matches and you know, and trips into Jerusalem and trips into here. And then, you know, later on, you know, when they go to Katadba and Karkur, they're kind of, you know, in the canal zone, they're kind of, you know, trips to Cairo, and it's all very jolly and they know everybody. You know, to war with Whitaker, you know, Lord Ramfurly, you know, he's a Sherwood Ranger until he gets captured. What you see, though, and very clearly from Stanley's diaries, is this transition from kind of sort of, it's all a bit of a lark, sort of Boy Scouts with guns and horses, and to suddenly it's all getting a bit serious. And there's this moment just after the capture of Tripoli where, in his diaries, he started to talk about all arms training and training in cahoots with the artillery and the infantry and all this sort of stuff. And you can see there is a competitiveness here. They want to be good. They don't want to be kind of sort of jolly amateurs with swagger sticks. They want to be really good soldiers. And they take this forward into Normandy. And by the end of the Second World War, they are the single unit with more battle honours than any other. You know, so it's an amazing transformation.
But this is very, I mean, because after all, the army receives a lot of stick for the interwar years that everyone just wants to drink gin and tonic and play polo, or cricket, and certainly you can read enough stuff to confirm that idea, that notion that that's what's going on in the army. But obviously, what happens to the Sherwood Rangers is they realise if you don't want to get killed, you're going to have to take. It's as simple as that. And of course, if you're you know, doing garrison duty in Malta in 1923, you might as well play cricket and drink gin because you're not caught in a meat grinder against the Germans. You know, who are taking it rather unsportingly seriously. You know, it's the imperative of the situation. And of course, the you know, part of the problem isn't it? Is no one quite. There's a whole lot of people who don't quite take it seriously enough, and you know, that includes the politicians chiefly, who aren't encouraging the army to take it seriously. But you know, it's the imperative of the moment. It's necessity being the mother of invention, isn't it? Literally.
Yeah. It's fascinating, and you know, and out of doing this, David and I together went round to interview some of the survivors. One of whom was this legendary legend of the Sherwood Rangers called John Semkin, and various others we went to talk to. And as out of that, then came the book that I'm now doing, because suddenly I had this growing kind of introduction to the Sherwood Rangers fraternity. I had a lot of material, and now I've got kind of eyewitness accounts of, you know, maybe 30 members of the Sherwood Rangers in that last 11 months of the war. And suddenly you've got, obviously Stanley will be included in the book, but there's a whole host of other characters who are equally colourful and interesting, around which you can really focus and do a really very dramatic telling of one unit's war from D-Day to VE Day. And, you know, and that trip to Germany was that I did actually again with David was part of it, you know, and you know, it's really exciting. It's exciting to go from that kind of sort of big campaigns like Normandy and, you know, War in the West, you know, this series I'm doing, to something which is much more kind of micro. It's really nice to do that and get to the nitty gritty of it.
Well, I ordered, while we were talking about this, I ordered the diaries for my Kindle, so I'll have a look at those.
You need that? I can give you a bloody paperback off. I've got hundreds of them.
Yeah, it's a sale, James Holland. What's wrong with it?
Yeah, well, you know, I just feel a bit bad.
You can't sign my Kindle, though, can you? That's the problem.
No, it's more that. It's not that. It's more the fact, sort of, you know, banging on and on and on about it, and then you have to kind of read it as well. But it is really good. It is really good.
Well, I'll give it a look once I've so much to read. Dear God.
I know.
Dear God.
I know.
Anyway,
and this is the problem, isn't it? You know, and then actually, I was listening to my brother's new podcast that he's doing with Dominic Sandbrook about actually talking about comparisons of the 17th century. Jolly interesting it was too. But he then says, if there's one historical novel everyone should read, it's Instance of the Finger Post or whatever it's called by Ian Pears, which I've heard about and never read. And he was thinking, God, okay, it's another book. Got to add to the list.
Too many books. Too many books. Well, we hope you've enjoyed today. Tons more coming at you with a load of stuff for Thanksgiving for our American friends who hopefully will have sorted out exactly who won that election by 5 million votes. Oh dear. And plenty more stuff and some interesting guests coming your way, some of whom might surprise you. Thanks very much for listening. We'll see you again soon. Cheerio.
Cheerio, everyone.